Thank you for joining us today. My name is Miško Stanišić. I'm a director and co-founder of Terraforming from Novi Sad, Serbia. And we are hosting this webinar or online seminar in the frames of two different projects that we are part of. There is a project called MemAct, Memory, Agency, and the Act of Civic Responsibility. It is realized with the support of the EU program Europe for Citizens, European Remembrance. MemAct brings together educators, researchers, and activists from different fields of Holocaust learning and civic education, and community work against racism and anti-Semitism from Austria, Serbia, Slovakia, Poland, and Germany. And in the frames of this project, we are exploring, developing, and trying to implement some new ideas in participatory learning about the Holocaust. And we're trying to enable communities to connect the past with current societal issues such as anti-Semitism. And then there is this other project called HANA, Challenging and Debunking Anti-Semitic Myths, which is co-founded by the Rights, Equality, Citizenship program of the European Union. And that also is a project that brings together 6 partners from Germany, Poland, Greece, and Serbia. And in this project, we are focusing on promotion of Jewish history and the enhancements of the Holocaust remembrance and the fight against anti-Semitism through capacity building training, awareness raising, and policy making contribution. Now, today's seminar we call the Authentic Site, Holocaust Distortion and Contemporary Anti-Semitism. And we will be discussing these issues during today's discussions. But we will start with the lecture by Dr. Ephraim Zuroff. Mr. Zuroff, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for taking your time and contributing to this event. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I think that you all know this, but still I will just say Dr. Ephraim Zuroff is the director of Simon Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem, and he holds his PhD in history. And of course, he's famous as one of the most important Nazi hunters. So without further ado, and in order to use our time in the most efficient way, I will call Dr. Zuroff to start with his presentation. Thank you, Dr. Zuroff.
Okay. Thank you very much, Miško, and thank you for the invitation to address this important conference. Today, I'm not going to be speaking to you about hunting Nazis, but rather about another problem, which of course is the problem of Holocaust distortion, a problem which is very prevalent throughout Eastern Europe. All you have to do is read the news every day, and you see on both sides of the conflict in Ukraine, you see examples of exactly what we're talking about. So Holocaust, I want to just make clear the distinction to begin. I want to make clear the distinction between Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion. Holocaust denial, of course, is the claim or the allegation that the Holocaust either did not take place at all, or that there was some Jews who were killed during World War II, but the number has been inflated artificially, falsely inflated, and there were no gas chambers. That's part of it. In some cases, they deny the gas chambers, they deny the death camps, but that's not what we're talking about. When we speak about Holocaust distortion, none of the parties involved are denying that the Shoah took place. I am going to focus my remarks on Eastern Europe and especially on Lithuania. the Baltic countries, and in these places, it would be impossible to deny the Holocaust because it took place in these areas, and initially began with what we call the Holocaust of bullets. And the territories of Eastern Europe are full of the evidence of this mass murder that initially started with the Einsatzgruppen and the local collaborators, and only later evolved into the industrialized mass murder that is one of the defining characteristics of the Holocaust we see in the death camps. So before the operation in the invasion of Ukraine began, Vladimir Putin said that Ukraine is a Nazi country, and he's invading Ukraine in order to denazify Ukraine. As far as Zelensky is concerned, Zelensky is saying that this is like the invasion is like the Holocaust, like a genocide, et cetera, et cetera. And we see on both sides, each side actually is trying to enlist the images of the Holocaust and the language of the Holocaust to gather support for their cause. On both sides, they're lying. I would tend to think that they all know that they're lying, but that hasn't stopped them. So let me get to the issue itself. What exactly are the aims of this movement, and who are the main offenders? I would say to you that basically there are 4 reasons for this phenomenon, and obviously I'll define it and I'll describe it and make it much more clear in a couple of minutes. The four goals of this phenomenon are: number 1, to hide or minimize the role played by local collaborators. You have to remember that only in Eastern Europe did collaboration with the Nazis include participation in systematic mass murder. Everywhere in Europe, in the countries that Nazi Germany occupied, as well as the countries allied with Nazi Germany, the Nazis attempted to enlist local assistance, and there were 3 reasons for this. 1, ideological reason, 2, practical reasons. So the ideological reason was they wanted to show that the local population in each of these countries supports the measures that they are about to take against the quote-unquote enemies of the Reich. Who are the enemies of the Reich? Well, primarily the Jews, but not only the Jews. The handicapped, mentally ill, chronically ill, Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, communists, and the homosexuals. And the 2 practical reasons are very simple. The Nazis controlled almost the entire landmass of the European continent, with the obvious exception of Great Britain and the Soviet Union. But every other country, with the exception of the 6 neutrals, were either occupied by the Nazis or allied with the Nazis. In other words, the 6 neutrals are Turkey, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Sweden. In every single other place in Europe, with the exception of Britain, of course, the Holocaust took place. So, to control a landmass, to control a geographical area of that size, obviously you need an enormous amount of manpower. So every person whom they could recruit to join them obviously made their task easier. But there's another thing to take into account. The final solution initially began by shooting. That was the method of implementation of the final solution. Let's take the example of Lithuania. Nazis come to Lithuania. They don't know the language. They are going to implement an unprecedented mass murder operation, which initially began with the murder of men and young boys, and later on to the entire Jewish population. every single one of these persons was supposed to be murdered individually by shooting. This is the way it started. It's not the way it ended, but that's the way it started. And if you think about it, that's incredibly, an operation of this sort is very labor intensive. The Nazis don't know the language. They don't speak Lithuanian. And they don't know the geography and topography of Lithuania necessarily. So they need local help. And in this case, they had no problem recruiting local help because you had zealous, many thousands actually, over at least 20,000 Lithuanians who were more than willing to help the Nazis. And they also had political reasons for helping the Nazis because their hope was that the Nazis would grant them their independence, which had ended. In other words, started in 1918, ended in June 1940 with the first Soviet occupation, and they hoped to get it back. And what better way to get it back than to help the Nazis murder what you could say in a certain sense the common enemy, who were the Jews. Okay, now as I said, outside of Eastern Europe, that was not the situation. Think about the situation in France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, Greece, Netherlands. In none of these countries, in other words, nowhere outside of Eastern Europe were the Nazis' allies asked to participate in systematic mass murder. In those countries, the Jews were identified. Discriminatory laws were passed against them. They were denied their privileges, they were denied the opportunity to make a living, and their life was made miserable. And ultimately, they were arrested, and they were brought either to a train station, or in some cases, like in Norway and in Greece, to a port, to a harbor. And that's where the extent and the local collaboration stopped. At no point were these collaborators involved in systematic mass murder as part of the final solution. Those Jews were sent somewhere else to be murdered by someone else. That somewhere else was Eastern Europe, in the pits of the Einsatzgruppen, or in the death camps, later on in the 6 death camps established in Poland. And that someone else was, of course, the SS, the Einsatzgruppen, who only numbered several thousand people, but were able to murder 1.5 million, primarily Jews, but not only Jews, in those countries in which they were operating. So, in other words, the role of these collaborators was very different than the role of the collaborators elsewhere, and far more problematic any way you look at it. Now, a second goal is to promote the canard of equivalency between communist and Nazi crimes. And they're insisting, these countries are insisting, if you read the Prague Declaration, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that communist crimes are genocide. Now, why is that contention? Why is that very important? Because if communist crimes are genocide, that means the Jews committed genocide. In other words, among the communist apparatchik, among the people then in the NKVD, people who carried out crimes against the peoples of Eastern Europe, there were Jews. Now, they didn't commit these crimes out of any loyalty to the Jewish people. These people who primarily left, who were fervent communists and who left the Jewish communities. In other words, they weren't taking their orders from Jerusalem, they were taking their orders from Moscow. Okay, the third point is that these countries need heroes. Whereas these new democracies of Eastern Europe need heroes. And who are their heroes? The heroes are people who fought against the Soviets after World War II. And that's very understandable. There's no problem with that. But what do you do in case these same heroes were actively involved in Nazi crimes? Shouldn't that disqualify them from being heroes? How can people who played a key role, for example, in the murders in Lithuania and Latvia, in Ukraine, who led troops like Bandera, Shushkevich, just to name two people from the OUN, okay, whose men, Bandera's men were actively involved in the massacres of Jews in Lviv and Ternopil during the first weeks after the Nazi invasion. And Roman Shushkevich was busy, the men of the UPA were busy murdering tens of thousands of Jews and Poles, not only Jews, by the way, okay, in the latter stages of World War II. So how can they be heroes with so much blood on their hands? Well, in Ukraine, it hasn't bothered anybody, or very few people, let's say. The parliament passed a law not long ago that Bandera's birthday, January 1st, is a national holiday. Not long ago, a brand new football stadium in Ternopil, or Ternopil as the Ukrainians call it, was dedicated, was built, and it was named for Shushkevich. And the fourth point is this: they are pressing for a joint Memorial Day to observe a Memorial Day for all the victims of totalitarian crimes. In other words, Nazi crimes and Soviet crimes, and communist crimes, excuse me. Now, what day have they chosen for this joint Memorial Day? August 23rd. And I'm sure you all know what happened on August 23rd, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, non-aggression pact between Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, the Third Reich. So in other words, they basically want to press or they want to make clear that you innocent observers might think that the entire blame for the 50 million lives lost in World War II is the blame of the Third Reich. Well, think again. The Soviets share that blame because by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they paved the way for the beginning of World War II and all the consequences, horrible consequences of that conflict. So those are the goals, and I want to go into explain exactly how they're being implemented. And I think the easiest countries to speak about, and the one way we see this the most clearly, is actually Lithuania. So first of all, let's talk. I have to give you the historical background of the Holocaust in Lithuania. And then we'll talk about it, why this has been so difficult. And these, have to emphasize that this problem is not a uniquely Lithuanian problem. This is a problem in every single country in Eastern Europe. And maybe I'll be able, if I have time, maybe I'll say a few words about the other countries and give other examples. So first of all, the facts. The facts of how the Holocaust played out in Lithuania. I'm sure all of you know that Lithuania was one of the new democracies, new republics created in 1918 in the wake of World War I and the self-determination of nations. And it maintained its independence from 1918 to 1940. In 1939, the Soviets invaded Eastern Europe, occupying Vilnius, and its surrounding area, and the rest of Eastern Poland. But they turned over the city of Vilnius, and the surrounding area to the Republic of Lithuania. Now, but on June 15th, 1940, Soviet Union invaded, basically took over Lithuania. In August, it was voted as a Soviet republic in some sort of fake election, of course. And the Holocaust began in June 22nd, 1941, with the Nazi invasion of Eastern Poland and Lithuania. Now, there were about 250,000 Jews who lived in Lithuania after the annexation, after Lithuania after Lithuania received Vilna and the surrounding area on a silver platter. There were about 80,000 Jews there who were added on to the 165, 170,000 Jews who lived in independent Lithuania. There were about 250,000 Jews, and about 30,000 of them were able either to run away to the Soviet Union or were actually deported in the mass deportations carried out by the Soviets on the week of June 14th, a week before the Nazi invasion. The Soviets deported thousands, tens of thousands of Lithuanians, among them actually a higher percentage of Jews than their percentage of the population. So we estimate that approximately 220,000 Jews lived in Lithuania under the Nazi occupation. Okay, now of these 220,000 Jews, only 8,000 survived in Lithuania. In other words, 212,000 were murdered, and 90% of them were murdered near their homes by shooting during the first 2 years, first year and a half, that 41, 42, like by the Einsatzgruppen and by the Lithuanian police battalions. Towards the end, about 30,000 Jews who survived, among the 30,000 Jews, among the Jews who survived, 30,000 were deported to camps. 5,000 elderly and children to Auschwitz and Sobibor, 15,000 to labor camps, concentration camps in Latvia and Estonia, and 10,000 from Kovna and Šiauliai to either Stutthof, that was mostly the women, or to Dachau, Germany, concentration camps in Poland or in Germany. And very few of them survived. Now, one of the characteristics of the Holocaust in Lithuania was the huge number of local participants. In other words, there were 20 Lithuanian police battalions created, 13 of them actively participated in the murders. There were 2 special mass murder squads. One was the Ypatinga Būris, the special ones, who were involved in the mass murders of the Jews of Vilna, primarily of Vilna, and the mass murders in Ponar, where approximately 70,000 Jews were murdered, and about 30,000 others, Poles, the Russians, etc. In any event, one of the examples of this Holocaust distortion could have been seen just a week ago. I don't know how many of you know this, but on March 31st and on April 3rd, the Holocaust monument, the Holocaust memorial at Ponar was desecrated. And how was it desecrated? It was desecrated by painting the letters Z and V on the memorials. Now, I'm sure many of you know that those letters are painted on the Russian military vehicles. And the implication is, and this is a very dangerous implication in a country like Lithuania, which is for the last 30 years has been afraid of Putin invading them, is that the Jews support the Russian campaign. I mean, that's in countries like in the Baltics, that's like high treason. Everyone is supporting Ukraine, and for obvious reasons, because they too are afraid. As a matter of fact, when the book that I wrote together with Ruta Vanagaita about Lithuania's role in the Holocaust and the way that the government is promoting a false narrative in that, when the book came out in Lithuania, so the head of national security went on national television, and besides accusing us of horrible lies, they basically said that the book is a threat to national security. Now, this is in 2016. So to be honest, at that time, it sounded absolutely absurd. You know, as a matter of fact, the American embassy called the government, told them to get a life and, you know, wake up. This is not a threat to Putin is not going to invade Lithuania now. But ironically, today, when I think back, it actually makes more sense. Not that it's about to happen. I hope, God forbid, it won't happen. But in any event, so that was the reaction among certain Lithuanians, and when the prime minister of Lithuania, Ingrida Šimonytė, issued a statement denouncing this desecration, these two desecrations, both the same way of painting the Z and V as a, she called it a provocation, which basically means that no Lithuanian could do this. But I mean, she had no evidence to say that, I don't think. But it's very easy for her to excuse Lithuanians, not excuse them, but just say that they had nothing to do with it. But the amazing thing about this was that on the one hand, she said correctly that Ponar is one of the most tragic places in the history of Lithuania, true. And what happened at Ponar? Nazis and other criminals murdered tens of thousands of Jews. That's very interesting. What do you mean other criminals? There was a special unit called Ypatinga Būris, the special ones, consisted of about 70 men, maybe a little more with replacements, who were the ones who carried out the mass murder of the Jews. And 95% of them were Lithuanians. But Lithuanian prime minister, they're not at the point yet where they can say the truth about the identity of the people who were the murderers. Of course, the Germans were responsible. Without the Germans, it wouldn't have happened. But they had thousands of willing helpers who were only too happy to carry out the murders. Anyway, so that's a classic example. All right, so now the issue, we all have to remember that these countries of Eastern Europe did not become Western democracies after they were liberated by the Soviet Army, by the Red Army. They simply switched a Nazi occupation, in some cases, which I'll name in a minute, for a Soviet occupation. In other words, you had 5 countries, 5 areas, geographic areas, which became Soviet republics. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, and Ukraine. They all became Soviet republics. Now, the rest of Eastern Europe, they all came under the yoke of communism. They're all part of the Warsaw Pact. Okay, now, so in other words, the decision as to what will be taught, what is the truth, the historical truth of the Holocaust, was not decided in Warsaw or in Belgrade or in Vilna or in Tallinn. It was decided in Moscow. What was the communist line about the Holocaust? So, first of all, you have to remember that the Soviets did their own distortion of the historical facts, and one of the primary and most terrible aspects of this is, of course, to fail to identify the victims and the perpetrators in terms of commemoration. Let's start, the most classic case, I think all of us know, is the case of Babi Yar. In Babi Yar, 33,771 primarily Jews, but not only Jews, were murdered on September 29th, 30th, 1941 by Einsatzgruppe C, if I'm not mistaken, Sonderkommando 10A or 10C, and with the active collaboration and participation of the Ukrainian security police. For many years, there was no monument at Babi Yar. And then some genius, you'll excuse me, in the Kiev municipality came up with an idea to build a football stadium there. We're talking in the late 50s or early 60s. And thank God that didn't happen. One of the reasons was the poem of the Russian poet, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, Babi Yar, by that name, basically a cry on behalf of the victims. And instead, a small monument was made, was put there. What's the caption? To the victims of fascism. Okay, wonderful. What does that hide? What does that caption hide? The identity of the killers and the identity of the victims. In other words, one of the aspects of communist distortion of the Holocaust was that they never, ever acknowledged the fact that the Jews were singled out by the Nazis to be murdered. You'll never see that anywhere. All the monuments in Rumbula and Ponar, and I visited them during the Soviet times, and it was all the same. No mention of the fact that the victims were Jews. And they also, in other words, the unique fate of the Jews was denied. Now, there are many reasons for that. And there's also the fact that the Soviets didn't identify the participants, the perpetrators, besides the Nazis. In other words, they were killed by Hitlerite fascists, by bourgeois Hitlerites. It's a typical Soviet language, etc. But they never spoke about the local collaborators. And this is because, first of all, they didn't want to acknowledge the fate of the Jews because they tried everything possible to assimilate the Jews and didn't want to single them out. And ironically, that fact was one of the things that sparked the renaissance of Jewish identity in the Soviet Union. One of the first things that the refuseniks, the people who wanted to go to Israel and were denied permission to go to Israel, did was to go to the places of mass murder to clean them up and have memorial services in secret. In other words, that backfired on the Soviets, you could say. I mean, there were other factors as well. Israel's victory in the '67 war and other things, it really rekindled Jewish identity in the Soviet Union, especially in the parts of the Soviet Union that had not been under Soviet rule for 50 years, like the Baltics, for example, or Eastern Poland. In any event, so they also did not want to acknowledge the role played by the locals because, listen, there was the myth of the brotherhood of Soviet peoples, and what ties together a Kazakh, a Tatar, a Estonian, an Armenian, a Georgian. It said they're brothers in socialism, brothers in communism. Oh, that's wonderful. But how, if that's the case, how can a Ukrainian communist murder a Jewish communist? Doesn't fit. So to make it, in other words, they hid the nationalist element of the local collaboration. And in addition, they actually put on trial many of the collaborators. But in many cases, it was for political reasons. In other words, the fact that they had joined the enemy, the perpetrators had joined the fascists, and not necessarily for specific Holocaust crimes. Okay, in other words, when these countries made the transition to democracy, for the first time, they were able to learn the truth, teach the truth, write the truth, teach the truth. Okay, so, and the issue of the Holocaust became very important for another reason. The main foreign policy objective of these new democracies was to be able to join NATO and the European Union. Why? I think you all understand why, for very obvious reasons. Who's going to defend them or prevent Russia from reconquering or reoccupying these countries? Think of little Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. Do you think they could possibly defend themselves against the Russians? Of course not. Even Ukraine and Belarus, the same. And certainly the same is true elsewhere. So the only obvious, well, I should say the obvious solution for them was to try and get entry to NATO and the European Union. Now, I sometimes jokingly say that the only place where they still believe the protocols of the elders of Zion is in Eastern Europe. Now, I'm assuming you all know what I'm talking about. Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a tract written in 1905 by the Russian secret police about a mythical plan of Jewish leaders to control the world. In other words, and this is the protocols of their meeting, how the Jews are going to take over the world. One of the, actually a very important anti-Semitic tract. But in Eastern Europe, many people think that Jews have undue influence in Brussels and in Washington. So in other words, the road to NATO, the road to the European Union goes through Jerusalem. In any event, how is that going to work? They need good relations with the Jews. Obviously, they're going to have to deal with the Shoah. They're going to have to deal with the Holocaust in some way. So there were 6 practical issues that these countries faced in trying to gain support from Jewish communities, especially from Israel and American Jewry, to join NATO and to be accepted into the European Union. So one is these countries have to acknowledge their guilt, their participation in crimes, and apologize. 2, commemoration of the victims. 3, the prosecution of unpunished Nazis. 4, the rewrite the history. All the history is Soviet propaganda, documentation. 5, education. All the textbooks you have to throw out because they're also Soviet propaganda. And 6 is restitution. Those are the 5 issues. Now, now we're 30 years later, more than 30, well, actually 32 years later, since the fall of the Soviet Union. And we're in a position to see how these countries dealt with these issues. So what I want to say to you is that the key to understanding what they're doing and how they're treating this subject is to check what is the narrative of the Shoah in each of these countries. So I want to deal with Lithuania. That's a country that I know very well. And I want to tell you a story of something that made a very strong impression on me. And I realized that it would be very difficult to get these countries to tell the truth. In 1990, a very impressive monument was dedicated in Ponar, the same Ponar that I mentioned before, where 70,000 Jews had been murdered. So the original monument had to the victims of fascism. This monument had it was a very nice monument, very impressive, and it had inscriptions in 4 languages, in Lithuanian, in Russian, in Hebrew, and in Yiddish. And it said that the Jews were murdered. It identified the victims. The Jews were murdered by the Nazis and their helpers. They refused to write local helpers because they said, well, I mean, that means every Lithuanian is guilty, which is, of course, absurd, as you can imagine. In any event, the keynote speaker in this event was Gediminas Vagnorius, who was the prime minister of Lithuania at the time, and he said the following. He said, first of all, that the Holocaust took more than an eye blink, a little more than 3 months. So there were many people, many guests from Israel for the dedication. Everyone's looking around at each other. What is he talking about, 3 months? It's 3 years, from 41 to 44. Okay. But then he said something that was absolutely outrageous. He said, the good reputation of a country which did so much to save its Jewish residents cannot be besmirched or cannot be ruined by a couple of social misfits, illiterates, people on the margins of society. Well, if that were the case, okay, but was that the case? That was not the case. The collaboration with the Nazis encompassed all strata of Lithuanian society, from the political leadership, which actually, many of whom ran away to Berlin during the first Soviet occupation, sat there under Hitler's protection, under the Nazis' protection, created the Lithuanian Activist Front, which sent messages of incitement against the Jews into Lithuania, talking about how the day of reckoning is coming with the Jews. Any Jew who betrayed Lithuania must be punished. There's no place for Jews in Lithuania now. Okay? The local administration, one of the fascinating things is this. When the Soviets came to Lithuania in June 1940, they fired all the local administration. And they replaced them with communists or people who were willing to support the communists. When the Nazis invaded, the leaders, the political leaders in Berlin told the people who had been dismissed from their jobs in 1940, in June 40 or July 40, to come back to their posts to serve the Germans. And what most people don't know, and this is an absolutely shocking figure, the number of Germans in Lithuania during the Nazi occupation was only 600 to 900, less than 1,000 Germans. So who did all the dirty work? Who arrested the Jews? Who guarded them? Who brought them to the pits? Who dug the pits? who murdered them together with the Einsatzgruppen. In some cases, in quite a few places, there were no Germans present even at the murders. In some places, we know for a fact, we know where, we even know where this thing took place. We know, and in some places, the only Germans present were those who were filming. They weren't even shooting. And we're talking about dozens of places. As a matter of fact, there was physical violence against Jews in 42 different places before the first Nazis actually arrived in Lithuania. And this is thanks to the measures of incitement of the Lithuanian activist front sitting in Berlin. So the figures are at least over 20,000 Lithuanians who took an active role. We're not even talking about people who stole the property or benefited from the looting of Jewish valuables, Jewish property, etc., of about 50,000 households, because there were 220,000 Jews in Lithuania. Okay, so now, in other words, now, so what's the narrative? This is the whole problem. The narrative in Lithuania is the Holocaust was a terrible tragedy. True, okay. The Nazis came and murdered our Jews. If you press them, as I explained what Wagnerius said, there were a couple of no goodniks, people who were delinquents or criminals, etc., but they're not part of us. Which this is basically a blatant lie. And as a matter of fact, I'll tell you one example of this issue of the identity of the perpetrators. Last June 27th, January 27th is International Holocaust Day. So a ceremony was held in the Seimas. The Seimas is the Lithuanian parliament. And the member of Seimas who was invited to deliver the lecture to honor the victims and speak about the importance of studying about the Holocaust, teaching the Holocaust, was the member of Seimas who's in charge of, there's a special committee for national struggles and historical memory. That's the name of the committee. And he said that, he began by saying how important it is to study how the Holocaust took place and the identity of the perpetrators. And then he goes on by saying, our heroes, and he named people like Kazys Škirpa. Kazys Škirpa was the head of the Lithuanian Activist Front in Berlin, a notorious anti-Semite, but he wasn't allowed, the Germans didn't allow him to go back to Lithuania, so he remained in Berlin. Or people like Nordico. Jonas Nordico was the liaison, Lithuanian liaison with the Nazis in Northwest Lithuania. He was the one who gave orders for Jews to go to be ghettoized in Žagar, and was involved in the murder of almost 20,000 Jews, etc. And then he said, and we also have to remember that there were Jewish perpetrators. What Jewish perpetrators? There was Jewish police in the Kovna ghetto and the Vilna ghetto. Now, how can you compare a Jew who's under coercion by the Nazis and joins the police, and especially in these places, the Jewish police went out of their way to help the Jews, not to do everything possible to circumvent the German orders, and a Lithuanian who voluntarily joined to mass murder Jews. So there was a very justifiable outrage by the Israeli ambassador, the German ambassador, the American ambassador, and he was dismissed from his post as chairman of this committee, or he resigned. I'm not sure whether if he hadn't resigned, he would have been fired, let's put it, because there was such a huge outcry against it. But this is part of the problem. In other words, in the eyes of the narrative promoted by the government is that we had almost nothing to do with it. So I'll give you an example. When the Lithuanian Association of Lithuanian Jews in Israel published a list of perpetrators, Lithuanian perpetrators, place by place, city, town, village by village, and they put it on their website. So the Lithuanian government, it was close to 25,000 names. Lithuanian government was furious. they put pressure on the Israeli Foreign Ministry to get the association to take it off the internet, and they commissioned an institution called the Genocide and Resistance Research Center. Now, this is their equivalent of Yad Vashem. In other words, any historical issue that has to do with World War II, they're the ones who determine if someone should be put on trial for war crimes, if someone should be recognized as one of the righteous among the nations. So they asked them to compile a list. Took them 3 years. They compiled a list of 2,055 people. And they said, well, it doesn't really matter because they were under German officers, and they had no choice but to do it. So first of all, it's important to say that those people who were involved in the units that did the shooting were actually given any possibility of not participating. And those who refused to do so were not executed and were not punished very severely at all. So in other words, and most of these people were volunteers anyway. So in other words, people volunteered for this task. They carried it out of their own free will. And this is something that the Lithuanians can't deal with. So what's the narrative? We didn't do it. This affects the attitude towards prosecution. This affects the attitude towards education. They're teaching lies. They did everything possible under the sun not to prosecute Lithuanians. I'll just tell you very briefly, many Lithuanian Nazi collaborators escaped to America. In America, they couldn't be prosecuted for their crimes because the crimes were committed overseas and the victims were not Americans. So what did the Americans do? They prosecuted them for civilian offenses, civil offenses, lying when they applied for refuge to immigrate. There was immigration and naturalization, citizenship violations. They were asked specific questions, which, if honestly answered, they never would have been admitted to the United States. But they lied, and they were able to get through the cracks. People didn't know the role that the Lithuanians played, whatever. But when these criminals were discovered living in America in the mid-70s and later on, they were put on trial. And in America, the punishment is they get stripped of their American citizenship, and then they can be deported. And at least 15 of them were deported. Almost all of whom, I think with one exception, went back to Lithuania. And some of them were actually big criminals. The head of the Lithuanian security in Vilnius, Aleksandras Lileikis, had a staff of 100 people who guarded the Vilna ghetto. They were the ones who took the Jews and brought them to Ponat to be murdered. He arrived healthy in Lithuania. Was he arrested? No. They let him go free, and they waited until he was sick. They passed 3 laws in the Semas, in the Lithuanian parliament, that a genocide suspect can be investigated even if he's not healthy. He can be indicted even if he's not healthy, and then you can have a trial from a video, with a video hookup. They tried 3 people. They never required them to show up. When Lileikis showed up of his own volition once at a hearing, I was there. They asked him, they didn't read him the indictment, the list of his crimes. They said, Mr. Lileikis, what do you have to say? He said, I did everything for my country. Then he had a heart attack on the spot. So in other words, this is all, the false narrative basically undermines every single aspect of their attitude towards the Holocaust. The same is true in Latvia, the same is true in Estonia, the same is true in Croatia, in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the biggest heroes today are Bandera and Šuškevič, whom I mentioned previously. Both heads of the OUN, Organization of Union of Nationalists, Ukrainian Nationalists, whose men were involved in mass murder. In Bandera's case in 41, in Lviv and Tarnopol, other places. Šuškevič's case in 43, where they murdered tens of thousands of Jews, and in Volyn, in Volyn and elsewhere. So this is what we're up against. And the problem is that most of these countries, I mean, Ukraine is not a member of IRA, but the other countries are members of IRA. IRA issued a very strong declaration calling for a fight against Holocaust distortion. Everything in IRA has to be done by consensus. So these countries, they signed on this declaration and they continue to tell their lies. So it's an absolutely crazy situation. And it starts at the top. Here, I told you what Simonaita, the prime minister, said. Nazis and other criminals, maybe the Martians landed from Mars and they're the ones who killed the Jews. And then they went back in a spaceship to Mars, so we can't catch them. Listen, I'm saying it facetiously, but it breaks my heart. I tell you the truth. As someone who's of Lithuanian Jewish origin, this is simply unacceptable. And the problem is that the EU and the Americans, Canadians, they don't put pressure on these countries and say, this is simply unacceptable. And I include in that my own country, Israel, who under Netanyahu refused to protest because he was trying to create a wedge between the EU members in the West who are obsessed with the Palestinians and the EU members in the East who couldn't give two shits, you'll excuse me, about the Palestinians. So it was a victim of politics. So truth and history can't survive without the right politics. And that's my message to you. Without political will to change this, it'll never happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zuroff. Always exciting and excellent to listen to you, and always very much inspiring. I would like to invite everyone to write their comments and questions in the chat. And in the meantime, if you are so kind to be with us for a couple of more minutes, I have 3 participants that have been listening to you very carefully that will give their comments and maybe ask some of the questions to you directly. So, Nevena, would you like to start? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Zuroff. It was a pleasure, as always, what Miško says. I would like just to ask first, because I think among our audience are most teachers. How we can, how did you document it? How we can use the activities of Simon Wiesenthal Center and your personal great job you did it in this last many few decades, and how we can use that? That is one of very concrete questions, because you collected so many evidence and so many stories that we should that we really need for that. And maybe it's that first one, and then I'll tell you something.
Listen, first of all, one of the things that I did, and I'm very proud of, was I wrote a book together with a very popular Lithuanian writer by the name of Ruta Vanagaita, a woman, female, not Jewish, who discovered that her family was involved, her grandfather and her aunt's husband were involved in killing Jews during the Holocaust. Now, we wrote this book in order to arouse, in other words, to give in a very accessible manner. In other words, not in a scholastic academic way, but in a more in a journalistic way, to tell the story of the events of the Shoah. And Ruta did research in the KGB archives in Vilnius, and she focused on 3 elements of Lithuanian society: the political leadership, whom I told you about, who ran away to Berlin and lived under the protection of the Nazis, and later some of them returned to Lithuania, tried to create an independent Lithuanian state, which the Germans immediately disbanded because they had no intention of giving them independence, okay? The local administration and the special murder squads, like the Ipatinga Buris who operated at Ponar. And we went to 40 places of mass murder where Lithuanians murdered Jews. By the way, what I didn't mention is that Lithuanians murdered over 5,000 Jews who were deported from Germany, Austria, and France to Kaunas, to Kovna, to be murdered. They sent a police unit to Belarus in October 6, 1941, and they murdered at least 20,000 Jews, Belarusian Jews, in 15 different places. And we went to 5 of those places. What's amazing is that in no monument in Belarus, which that's like the copy of the Soviet Union, Belarus, okay, did they mention that the murderers were Lithuanians. And we wrote a book about it. We taped our conversations as we went from place to place. And the issues that we spoke about were, first of all, the identity of the killers. All the people we interviewed, any person who looked old enough to live in World War II, to be alive in World War II, we interviewed. And the question that we asked every single one was, who committed the murders? And invariably, every single witness, all of them non-Jews, they said the Lithuanians committed the murder. And they told us some really heartrending stories about one family who had a very intense discussion within the family. Can they save a Jewish friend of hers? She was 8 years old, this woman, and she had a friend, a Jewish friend, and they were thinking of trying to save her. So I asked this woman, but you must have been afraid of the Germans. So she said, no, we could have hidden her from the Germans forever. We were afraid of our neighbors. And she started crying, something terrible. And I had the impression it was the first time she was able to share this story with someone who sympathized with her, with the victims. And this was all in the book. This was all in the book, and became a runaway bestseller. 20,000 copies were sold. It was the most read book in public libraries for 3 years running. So, in other words, we went to create a tool to bring the knowledge to every halfway intelligent person in Lithuania. And what emerged was that many young people read the book, and now we created a counter narrative to the false narrative. Now, the name of the book in Lithuanian, this is very important. The name of the book in Lithuanian was Mūsiškiai. Mūsiškiai means our guys, our people. And I'll show you a copy. I'll show you something interesting. The book, this is the cover of the book. Okay, now, if you look at the letters of the title, you see that there are 2 faces. Okay? One face is of a Jew, the other face is of the commander of the murder squad at Ponar. And it's difficult to see who's the Jew and who's the Lithuanian. So the Jew represented Lithuania in 2 Olympics, in 24 and 28. He was a cyclist. He was murdered in the Kovna ghetto, or as Ruto would say, good enough to represent us at the Olympics, not good enough to live. And the other one, this one, Balas Noveja, was the commander of the murder squad in Ponar. And what Ruta, who knows Lithuanian society far better than I do, her message was the message she wanted to give was, you say that the people who murdered the Jews, that the victims were Jews, so they're not important, they were communists. The whole myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, which was so prominent in Eastern Europe, before and during World War II. So the victims are not important. And you say that the killers are also not important. They're not part of us. They're the misfits, the illiterates, the social outcasts. Well, we have news for you. Both groups, the Jews, the victims, and the killers, were an integral part of Lithuanian society.
Thank you. I have one more, just a brief of, Miško, should I leave other? Just like, what do you think at the moment with the current war in Ukraine? How ethical is, if we, just a few ideas that I'm having, it's like this comparison with the Holocaust is one part of the standard propaganda that we know from every conflict. Especially the images we know for a war in Yugoslavia, using images, using terminology, that's really a propaganda misusing Holocaust, hijacking Holocaust and the suffering of Jews. What do you think, how ethical is for teachers, let's say, to start to tell the story about Second World War and Holocaust while we have a conflict nowadays? Like how ethical is to use Bandera and the whole Slava Ukraine and that kind of things?
We, in Israel, we faced a very problematic dilemma. We have a very long account with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews. In the 17th century, Khmelnytsky pogroms, 200,000 Jews were murdered. He has a huge statue in the heart of Kiev. He's their big hero, the biggest hero, even bigger than Bandera. Petlura, after World War I, 100,000 Jews were murdered in the wake of World War I. Then Bandera and Shushkevich. Now, we sent them 100 tons of humanitarian aid. We sent them a field hospital because we could not, listen, we don't hold the sins of the grandfathers against the grandchildren. But of course, we object to turning these people into heroes. But when the guns are being, innocent people are being killed, we can't say because of that, we won't help you. It's a humanitarian disaster. And Israel is a Jewish state, a state with a heart and a conscience.
Thank you. Let me ask if you can spare a couple of more minutes. Wolfgang Schmutz, he is calling from, or he's sitting there in Austria. He's a curator and educator in the field of education about the Holocaust. And we are working together in this MemAct project. Wolfgang has been listening to your presentation, and let's hear some comments and maybe a question from Wolfgang. I mean, it is already interesting because Austria is a different kind of country from the countries that you've been talking about in the East, but also facing their own problems with facing the past and acknowledging their role in the Holocaust.
Thanks, Miško. Thanks, Dr. Zuroff, for the presentation. And you're absolutely right, Miško. I was listening with my Austrian ears, so to speak. And it made me think a whole lot of also the four main reasons you made up for distortion and denial. And one could also speak to it from an Austrian perspective very much. What was running through my head is that in most of the areas you mentioned, we had victims from Austria, but we also had perpetrators from Austria. Yeah. And I have to say that to date, the consciousness of Austrians is visiting domestic memorial sites. By domestic, I mean places like Mauthausen or Hartheim. Sure. And we are even in the German-speaking lands, we are into this terminology of National Socialism. We even coin the whole subject matter, not the Holocaust. We don't say Holocaust education. This is creeping in from the international sphere, but it's not yet our consciousness. And in doing so, we follow up a tradition which was established early on in the post-World War II period, which was to only hunt down perpetrators who committed crimes on Austrian soil, which naturally didn't include all the ones deeply involved in the Holocaust, especially in the Eastern sphere of Europe. So this is how I'm listening to you with my Austrian ears and wondered, what does it mean to connect the dots? Because I dare to say that also today's Austria, it's not part of our consciousness to understand that this collaboration you are talking about, the direct involvement in mass murder, very often was orchestrated by Austrians, be it in Serbia, be it in Poland, in all the Reinhardt camps. I'm not discussing the numbers. There was a huge discussion of how many Austrians in proportion whatsoever, right? But just the mere fact that Austrians were involved in the master plan and also in the concrete making the events happen is not really part of Holocaust education Austria, and it's even not called Holocaust education, not really. So that's more of a statement, I bet, but I'm curious to hear your reaction anyhow. Thank you.
Okay, so let me tell you that Austria is the place where I've had so many disappointments and so many rejections. I didn't talk about Nazi hunting. if I would have spoken about that, one of the first things I would say is there hasn't been a successful prosecution of a Nazi in Austria in 45 years, if I'm not mistaken. And it's not for lack of Nazis, as we all know, okay? So I'll never forget my meetings with Karin, the Austrian Minister of Justice, at some point, when you know, when they told me that Erna Walisch, who served as a guard at Majdanek, could not be prosecuted in Austria because what she did was passive complicity in genocide. Now, this is a woman who was a guard in Majdanek who admitted taking people to be gassed, for God's sake. So I tell you, I had one of the most, I was a furious press conference I ever had was in Austria about after I spoke to Gastinger, and she told me this passive complicity in genocide bullshit. You'll excuse me. So you know, and I've used that in practically every single lesson that I give to teachers. I talk about that. I'll give anyone a prize who can explain to me what is passive complicity in genocide. Genocide, we know. Okay, complicity, we know. What on earth is passive? He's watching television while he shot someone in the head. I mean, it's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. So actually, I was just in Vienna 2 weeks ago at a conference at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. And it was actually quite interesting, but it was about Nazis who escaped to South America, not the Nazis in Austria. So I would hope that, you know, Wiesenthal always said, I don't know if you know this quote, he said that Austrians were responsible for more than 1/3 of the victims of the Holocaust. Now, Wiesenthal wasn't very good with math, I'm telling you. He made all sorts of comments that were a little questionable, but you get the point.
So maybe I'll follow up with then a question more, Miško, if I may, which is also on with my European ears listening to you, I should say how complex and complicated it is if it is about countering and facing all of these narratives. And as you explained, it's also linked to a very new rewriting history and nation building process from 1990 on. So what does it mean and how can we tackle that? Because there's a cross-European involvement here as well. It's not only about, to me, Lithuania coming to terms, Serbia coming to terms, whoever coming to terms with the past Austria. It's all connected and intertwined. And so I wonder if this is maybe the ambition, which is beyond the political ambition, to come to terms within your own national frame. I wonder if it means that education needs to actually cross these boundaries, because this is the reality of the history we're looking into.
Okay, so I have the privilege, I say really, I have the privilege of addressing many teachers who come to Yad Vashem, including Austrian teachers, including Serbian teachers, Miško. And I always talk to them about the importance of what they're doing. And to, in a sense, give them, you know, a boost and to try and get them, you know, to understand how important what they're doing is in that framework. In other words, that they've come to Yad Vashem and they've sat in some cases for 10 days, for a week, 10 days, even in some cases in 3 weeks. And they're given the tools to be able to convey the important lessons. But each country presents its own nuances, presents its own problems, and this is part of the problem. But one of the things I've learned over the years is the best way for someone like me to be able to achieve any sort of progress is to partner with locals. We need local allies. So I would say to you that what you're doing is super important, but you could also get the help of people from the outside, from places like Yad Vashem, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, you know, and groups like this, who can give you, you know, sort of hone your skills because I mean, I assume that in Austria, the teachers are, I mean, I've met many Austrian teachers, and many of them do have the motivation, some not so much, but it's an enormous challenge. It's really an enormous challenge. And you know what I say, I come from a family of teachers. I always say teachers are overworked and underpaid, but you have to ignore that fact and get onto it and do everything you can to teach these kids that you're entrusted with these kids, and to explain to them about the Holocaust and the lessons of the Holocaust. And there's a lot of material that there is out there, and that's what we depend on. But I'll tell you one thing though, in the wake of our little discussion here, one thing that comes through, and is like a silver lining, but a very problematic silver lining. If anyone needed any proof that we have successfully convinced the world that the Holocaust is the worst tragedy, just listen to these stupid politicians talking in the last month, last month and a half in Ukraine and in Russia. So when the president of the Ukrainian, I think it's the Duma, the parliament, said that this is Bucha is the Holocaust of the 20th century, I said he gets an A in propaganda and an F in history.
Yes, we will continue this discussion, obviously pending between Serbia and Austria, which I think is very exciting, particularly because we have this great person back in Israel. Next person here to speak will be Karin. Karin Schneider is the head of art education at the Museum of the City of Linz. And also we're working together on the MemAct project. Karin, you have been listening, and what have you heard with your Austrian ears?
Again, Austrian ears, exactly, yes. First of all, thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Zuroff. This was really inspiring, and thank you to Terraforming and also the HANA project to make this keynote possible. And of course, it triggered a lot in my Austrian ears, because all these ideas of this were not us. As you said, yeah, the Nazis were some aliens coming from the Mars, and they are not us. And if us, then yes, our grandparents, they were forced to do it. If they were not a member of the Nazi party, they would.
Total lie.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So we know today, Karin, if you just excuse me, this Entschuldigen, okay? One of the amazing things that we've learned over the years, and I want to tell you that historians have looked high and low. There is not a single case of anyone who was ever executed for refusing to murder Jews. Not one case.
Exactly. And also not for not being a member of any organization or the Nazi party, or Aryanizing property and taking the flat that does not belong to you, and so on. And still, when you do workshop with also young students nowadays, and even with the teachers then interfere very often. This was my experience also when I did the workshop in the exhibition about the young Hitler we had in the City Museum of Linz. The young students were usually very open-minded and to discuss and to dig deeper. And very often we had the problem that the teacher said, yeah, well, but you have to understand the people were also under pressure. They had to do it. They had to be a member of even the curators of exhibitions say things like, well, they had to be members of the Nazi parties. So in a way, what you said in this direction, this sounded very familiar for me. So even in the center of where the Holocaust was cooked, ideologically and then politically, you have the idea the Nazis were not us. And we were forced, and we were under a kind of a magic spell that put us under trance or so. Yeah. And yeah, this is not necessarily a question, but maybe the general question of what you think, how, I mean, I was trying to open up the museum as a space where you can really also dig into this on a personal level, to share also family histories and family myths. We have, fortunately, in Austria, I think you know Margit Reitzer, for example, who is a professor in the University of Salzburg. I think she was also in this conference now in the Wiesenthal Center. And she did her habilitation about family myths in Austria, and talking and not talking about the past. And we invited her, for example, to the museum to really open up to personal family histories. But I have to say it is insofar difficult as even curators and officials of cultural institutions in Austria still believe this myth of we are more victims than perpetrators.
No, of course. You have no idea. To be a victim is fantastic. It gives you all sorts of privileges, you know?
If it's no one
can shout at you, no one can say you did something wrong. I'm a victim, I'm a victim. But
if
listen,
you're not a real victim, if you're not a victim, yeah.
I wanted to say something. One of the things, in other words, I mentioned the idea of the local allies, which is so important, okay? But there's one other thing that I think is also very important, especially for the teachers. And that is to the information, the accurate narrative has to be packaged differently. In other words, it has to be in a form that is accessible. So let me tell you a story. I should have mentioned this before. You'll excuse me for mentioning my co-author in Lithuania, because she wrote a second book, not with me, I'm sorry to say, but with Christoph Dickmann. Christoph Dickmann is the leading scholar, leading historian on the history of the Holocaust in Lithuania. He wrote a 1,600-page book called German Occupation Policy in Litauen. It's in German, it's his thesis. And she wrote a book with him. What they did was after she wrote our book, together, she had many questions that she wasn't sure of vis-a-vis the actual history of how the Holocaust played out. So she wrote another book called How Did It Happen? And she is asking questions and Christoph is answering, and no one knows the history better than Christoph. And it's in a very simple, down-to-earth way. It's coming out, I think it's now out in English also. And I highly, highly recommend the book. It's fantastic. I said to Ruta, when I read they did the book in English because that's the common language between them. Okay, so I read the book. I said to Ruta, listen, Ruta, if our book is a bomb, this one is a nuclear bomb. You understand? So I very strongly recommend it. And I think if you read it, you can recommend it also. And it's an example. And in a sense, we need a book like this on every country in Europe where the Holocaust took place.
Mr. Zuroff, it was now my turn to comment and ask if you could comment. Namely, you said passive complicity in genocide. I had to write this down because it is an amazing statement. But I would ask about passive complicity in distortion. Namely, on many places around Europe, probably in the world, but I know a little bit about Europe. For instance, recently in Amsterdam, they opened a huge new memorial of names of 102,000 Jewish names that were taken in the Holocaust. And I stood there and I read the short text, and it says Jews were taken, then they were sent.
Where was this? Where was this?
Amsterdam.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. It is the new, recently built memorial of names
for the Jews of Holland.
Yeah, exactly. So the very short, very brief text is in passive. It's like taken away, sent to camps. So you have no ideas who did it, and it
terrible.
This doesn't sound well. So when I discussed similar problems with your colleague Mark Weitzman, he called it distortion by omission. I liked the construction like distortion by omission. I think it's a problem. It is I think that we should call this distortion as well, because as a result, the people that are living in our societies are getting this distorted, understandings of what happened, who did what I mean, what are we even remembering, etc. So I would like you to comment on this, please, and also, how is distortion related to anti-Semitism? Not only that it's coming obviously sometimes from the anti-Semitic sources, but also it is resulting in anti-Semitism, or at least bedding for new waves of anti-Semitism. If you could just comment on that. Okay, so, and then we have Mr. Darschmidt.
There's no question that distortion paves the way for anti-Semitism. It robs the Jews of their victim status. It robs the Jews of their foundational story of the Jewish life in the 20th century. I mean, there's two of them. One is the Shoah, the other one is the establishment of the State of Israel. And if you see very clearly that the anti-Semites are trying to rob the Jews of both. In other words, they deny the Jew victim status, or the primary victim status. And they also are busy trying to claim that we're not indigenous people to the land of Israel, and we don't deserve this Jewish state. Only Jews don't deserve a country of their own, understand? And IRA makes it very clear that this is anti-Semitism, and they're 100% right. The problem is that the countries who are distorting the Shoah, they signed on this declaration as if they're supporting it, and they're the main proponents of it.
Obviously. Nevena, I had a very brief question, and then I'm sorry, Schmidt.
Okay. I was just thinking, this comparison that we just saw with current conflicts and using images, terminology. What do you think? Would that lead to the new waves of anti-Semitism, or how do you see that with your Jewish ears?
Jewish ears.
Just
listen. I think that obviously, when Holocaust education is done correctly, doesn't cause anti-Semitism. It causes just the opposite, and that's, you could say this is one of the measurements. In other words, if something like teaching the Holocaust leads to anti-Semitism, something is wrong somewhere, obviously. Okay, and it's a question of empathy. People naturally have empathy for people who are real victims, but this is precisely why the communist world, this Prague Declaration. I didn't give you the details. But the Prague Declaration of June 3rd, 2008, signed by 33 Eastern European, mostly Eastern European intellectuals, wants parity between communist crimes and Nazi crimes. And this is I'd say two things. First of all, part of the problem is that communist crimes have not gotten the attention that they deserve. Okay, but on the other hand, communist crimes are not genocide. That's just not genocide. There was never any attempt. Even the Holodomor was not against the Ukrainian people. It was against the economic class of kulaks. So, and they're trying to, in a sense, to hang on to the Shoah and give it the same status, because that's it. I mean, the Shoah is it. That's, we're number one. I mean, it sounds crazy, but we're number one in the suffering, in the suffering Olympics, right? There's a funny joke in Israel about a sprinter. There was an Israeli who wanted to, who was supposed to compete in a sprint in the Olympics, or say in some very important athletic event, we're running, and he insisted that he be allowed to have a lead of 5 meters. So they said, you can't do that. That's not the way it works. So he says, haven't the Jews suffered enough already?
Excellent. Listen, we have a question from audience. Thank you very much, Mr. Friedman, for waiting. But there was a list of questions. So obviously, we are getting back to some Austrian ears, if I understand correctly.
Right, thank you. Actually, I can also add something to the Amsterdam thing. In Leipzig, there's a memorial where it's written, the Jews that were exterminated by the fascist hordes. And I asked my host there.
It's East Germany.
It's Germany. Where did the hordes,
that's the communist way. No?
Where did the hordes come from and where did they go after? So me, myself, I researched 25 years my own extended family, and I wrote a book. It's called Tell It to Your Child, National Socialism in One's Own Family. And just recently, when the war in Ukraine started, I had a kind of a shock moment, because in the first week, now I didn't hear it in any of the media, but in the first week there was talked about European volunteers from all over Europe that are going to fight in Ukraine. So I was asking myself, who is those volunteers? And I digged in my archive, and I have a book that was published in 1959 by Felix Steiner. Rings a bell. It was the Standartenführer, the only Waffen-SS general that was not sentenced in Nuremberg, but just because they didn't have the evidence. If they would have the evidence today, he would have been executed probably. And he wrote in this book about the volunteers from all over Europe. He's talking about 6,000 Danes, about 15,000 Wallons.
Right, from Scandinavia, sure.
To make it short, so now if I Google the Azov regiment, or if I Google
Azov regiment, right? Yeah.
On the other side, I Google the Wagner group with the runes, and they are pure fascists. And now I have the question, because you said the grandsons not to blame for the grandparents, but the question is, what is the untreated narrative, like this wrong narrative, capable to cause in the next generation, like to reenact things, like who is going there to fight, probably in the
white supremacists. The white supremacists are going to fight against the Slavs.
Based on a old European memory that was preserved in all these families. I thought about that. Probably one of these new neo-Nazi volunteers, if he digs in Kharkov, he probably will find the bones of my grand-uncle, the Sturmbannführer, who died there. And it's his comrades were probably the grandfather of this guy.
You're right.
Yeah, there was a question and then respond by Dr. Zuroff. I think Nevena asked, and then Dr. Zuroff said that if the education is done properly, there is no danger of it being misunderstood or contributing to further anti-Semitism. I think that the same goes to the question of teaching about perpetrators. It is something that teachers, when it comes to perpetrators from own national group, our teachers are not so keen to do this. I mean, it's not about the teachers, it's about looking at the dark corners of own history and first being brave enough to talk about it loudly, but then secondly also, and I think that, and I believe that we should, of course, because when we look at the goals identified by IRA, for instance, of the teaching about the Holocaust, developing critical thinking, growing as individuals, etc., I think that this is where the most important questions are. Understanding how a person could become a perpetrator is at least, in my opinion, important as understanding the processes, the societal processes that led to the genocide, because this is what we have to recognize in ourselves in order to prevent this to ever happen again. So I think that teaching and learning about perpetrators and perpetratorship in own national corpus is extremely important, and I'm saying it even, of course, from Serbian side. Yes, sure, Serbs were in large number of victims, but of course we all have our own collaborators, and we should not be afraid to talk about them clearly and loudly, and learn those lessons precisely from those guys. And also precisely because we actually have such a history, such a record of resistance and fighting so fiercely against the Nazis and others. Well, Mr. Zuroff, I don't want to take more of your time. You already spent more than an hour, and I promised 1 hour only. But I will ask you if you have only just some concluding words before I mean, you are most welcome to stay. We will have another presentation in just a minute or two. It's very interesting. A group of teachers that brought their students to Sajmište for the very first time and their reactions. But in any case, if you have some concluding words for this part of our event, thank you.
Listen, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And it was very interesting to hear the comments of the participants, especially from Austria. And I'm well aware of the obstacles that they're facing. And I think that, you know, they're heroes in a sense to work against, to go against these conditions and against, you know, the atmosphere. And that's why their work is so valuable. So keep up the good work, Karin, Wolfgang, and anyone else there whose name I can't see, and in general, and in all these countries, so it's so important. These are the new heroes. We need the people who are going to go against the tide and explain to people you're not victims, you're grandchildren of people, of perpetrators maybe. You're not guilty, but you have to know what they did, why they did it, and the horrible consequences.
Thank you, Mr. Zuroff. We will then continue to the next part of our event. We have Lidija, Župančić, Šuica, and I don't know if Maya is there. Is she? Okay. In any case, Lidija. Yes. Okay. Great. Well, Lidija, you have your presentation. So please lead us in, explain what happened, why, who, what, when, and we will discuss it in a bit further on. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Miško, and thank you everyone for watching and participating in this really excellent conference. I would like to welcome you all to the session Authentic Holocaust Sites Encounter with Staro Sajmiste. So as Miško presented, my name is Lidija. I come from Belgrade, Serbia. I'm a teacher and teacher trainer from the 14th Grammar Belgrade School. Actually, I would like to inform you about the visit I conducted with high school students from Belgrade, together with my colleague who is also attending this conference, MemAct is Keynote. I would like to present you the activities of learning about the Holocaust that we undertook with the aim of research multicultural heritage and build. Students from Serbia and Austria were supposed to meet online last week and share their impressions about the memorial site they had previously visited. But due to health issues from Austrian part, the meeting was postponed. And I hope that we will have this meeting because the students were very eager and keen to see their fellow Austrian students. And of course, feel very sorry that the students didn't have the chance to exchange their impressions about the sites they had previously visited. I will now share the presentation and pictures about the visit and the sightseeing of the Staro Sajmiste. Okay. Yeah, that would be really cool. Okay, Karin, thank you. I would like to share the presentation that I made for this for this event. Well, I hope that you can see the
Yes, we
Just
can.
put it in a full screen. Great,
okay.
that's it. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So actually, we gathered 6 high school students age 18 who participated in this extracurricular activity that Maya and I conduct in our school in Belgrade. I have to say that 14th of Belgrade Grammar School is a downtown in the center of Belgrade school, which is a very good school, among the best in Belgrade. So the students are also very eager and very good students. These are the pictures that you can see from the site when we were on the spot on 22nd of March. So we visited the old fairground Gestapo camp. Miško told me that you know all about this memorial site. I actually deleted the pictures on where actually the fairground complex is and its history. So I will just inform you about the visit that we made and their impressions. You can see here a group of 6 students and our colleague, my colleague, Maya. During our visit, and you can see the spot itself here, how it looks now. So you see that it's quite large. It's very ruined and devastated. And of course, you see that the memorial site isn't really a proper memorial site, a place of remembrance. It has some monuments dedicated to the remembrance, but all in all, I have to say that actually this is a very ruined and destroyed place due to its history. And you see that the first memorial plaque was put here in 1974. It was dedicated to the 40,000 people from all parts of our country who were brutally tortured and killed here. And after this plaque was replaced with another one, the same inscription appeared. And you see here, you can see us visiting and reading and talking about this memorial monument. I have to say that prior to the visit, they were just informed about the visit and we didn't share any other information with them. I said before that they were 18 years old students, very good with their grades, very well educated. Some of them are really excellent and are intending to go further on some European universities. But most of them didn't know anything about the site, except that it served as a camp during the Second World War. You will see that we suggested a questionnaire after the visit, and they had answered the questions, and you'll see their impressions about the place. None of them ever visited the site before or knew anything about the liquidation of the Jews. They knew only that it was a concentration camp. They were very unpleasantly surprised about the state in which the camp is. As you saw before, it's really destroyed and very ruined. There are a lot of garbage. There are you can see all kinds of animals over there. You can see marginalized groups of people living in very poor conditions over there. So after the visit, we asked them to fill this questionnaire in order to present their impressions about the visit. And here you can see the questions that we suggested to answer. So the first question was, prior to sightseeing the location of Staro Sajmiste, did you know anything about the history? And here you can, on the next slide, you can see their answers. Most of them said no, except that it was a concentration camp, or even they didn't even know what it was. The second question was, if yes, what exactly did you know about the history of Staro Sajmiste? So most of them, as you can see here, absolutely nothing. I have to say that, for example, this is a very motivated, very eager student. She's our top student, leaving on a very distinguished university. Very little indication of what it was. No museum about it. Not really sure what she was trying to say, but anyway, they really had no prior knowledge about this place. The third question was, in what state is the memorial site? You see that they all wrote that they were horrified with the state of the memorial site. They were very depressed after they saw it. The fourth question was, how did you feel during the visit? Most of them wrote that they were very sad. They were somehow ashamed. This girl writes, depressed by the current state of the site. I was shocked by the history, and I'm happy that I learned something important. Most of them share the same impressions. And the fifth question, what do you think should be on the location of Staro Sajmiste? As you can see, most of them agreed that upon the opinion that it should be a memorial site, some kind of a museum with its history and an indication of how it looked for people living there and how sadly others die. Most of them, as you will see probably, most of them share the same impression. So really, I have to say that all of us really shared this. They were impressed by this monument. I am not sure if you knew that this is a newly erected monument in 1995, but to all those who perished at the Sajmište camp, but also to victims of the notorious Ustasha concentration camp, Jasenovac. So this is the current state of the memorial site. They were very eager to know everything about it. We tried to explain. I have to say that Maya, this is Maya, my colleague, really tried to explain everything very thoroughly and very dedicated, really, herself to the explanation of its history. So I think that for the students, this visit was very, very necessary. They were very grateful. They felt, of course, very sad and depressed a little bit, but I have to say that this was an extracurricular activity. I am not a history teacher. I am a civic education and art teacher, and I usually don't take students to these kind of places. Not only that is a little bit further away from our school, but it is also a very dangerous place for students to be in. As you have seen, it's very dirty, it's rather unsafe. So if there wasn't this suggestion made by Miško, I don't think I would have gone to this place. with students, because I would really be afraid for their safety, and I would really be a little bit afraid of if something might happen to them. So this is the presentation I prepared.
Wolfgang has a virtual hand up.
Thanks, Miško. I feel inclined to bring it back to what Lidija did, which I regard very courageous. She brought youngsters without any prior knowledge, and she exposed herself, also a teacher, to the situation where they're not well informed, well prepared, and meeting this situation. And I think this could be a potential key or way in to make the students, whatever they make out of it, whatever they know in advance, the starting point. So I think, Lidija, in what you did, there is the potential to continue from there. And I regard it much stronger an approach than to create the 2-3 lessons you will teach about the Holocaust. Because very often in these lessons, let aside that they are not research-based most of the times, but full of assumptions, what we think is feasible and what we think is effective, brackets closed. Very often the student itself is not the starting point. The consciousness of the student is a goal, but not the reality in our education. It means it doesn't become the starting point of it. And it reminds me also what your profession is, Avi, right? So to make the understanding, and also I believe both Friedemann and Rea were hinting towards embodied knowledge, either a lack of embodied knowledge or the sense of a lack of embodied knowledge, or the fact that there is embodied knowledge and it can come out in different ways for different individuals. But to start from that realization, to start from how does it connect or not connect with me, now that I'm confronted with it, I regard a very strong starting point. But it means, accordingly, that our education needs to be informed by different kinds of strategies. It needs to be informed by different kinds of capacities. It's not anymore to design the best lesson ever about the Holocaust. It's more informed with, how do I deal with the realizations my students will have? How do I deal with their digesting process? You were drawing on the spiral, right? If this is the starting point for a spiral, what is the next layer I put to this? And how do I build to a consciousness which rhymes with what was the presentation of Ephraim Zuroff today? It's us. Okay, so how do I build to that kind of an understanding? And I would always argue that coming from education at authentic sites, the bunk in the barrack is helpful to draw on the reality of prisoners. It's not helpful to draw on the complexity of complicity surrounding the bunk, because very easily we get absorbed for very logical reasons by this incredible reality. And despite talking about the situation, there is a huge barrier between us and the ones who experienced it. But how to build and to circle around the very bunk, beyond the perimeter of the camp, out into this very society who allowed perpetration to be performed in that way, is very complex. And what I liked about what you did, Lidija, is you walked from there to the very monument, but taking this very positioning of the youth serious. It's not their professionals of the Holocaust. It's not their professionals in memory. It's not that you've always mentioned how well educated they are, but despite being that well educated, there is a gap. So how do we go about the gap? Bettering their knowledge, is it the answer to it? I think in what you tried to do and started, there's an answer beyond knowledge. It goes towards understanding, and that's a different kind of thing. Sorry for being longish here, but this is how towards the end of the program, I feel potentially the dots connect for me.
Oh, great, Wolfgang. This is a core of what we are discussing, of course, trying to involve new perspectives in let's say, not only gaining knowledge, but also gaining the experiences and the questioning what we want to do with the memory.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something maybe, because Lidija, you said in the beginning that there was the idea that we do similar experiences with a youth group in Austria, in Linz, and then the two youth groups match. I mean, actually, the basic idea would have been that they come actually to your place, like with their bodies, not only through Zoom, but because of the situation we all know, we gave up on the journeys. But actually, the idea behind was also that beside everything we touched now in the discussions in Holocaust education in Austria and in schools, and in school also how it is represented in school books, we saw this big gap of the diversity of classrooms we actually have in Austria. People coming with migrant backgrounds, with refugee backgrounds, also people from students from third generations coming from former Yugoslavia, for example, because their grandparents came here to Austria to work here, basically, or coming from now like refugees from war contexts. And this triggered now something with me, the discussion you had before about war, because I thought, yeah, but the reality of education is that we have a very mixed reality, at least when we work with young students, and we have different experiences and different backgrounds. So listening to the experiences of the students, or what the students themselves make out of this history, could also mean that that they can teach us something about their specific experiences, if they come from a refugee background, for example. So it is not that we, as coming from education, need to know everything. So, but we work together with those who are part of the programs we do.
I wanted to harshly react on the movie thing, because first of all, I'm a filmmaker. I know what we are talking about. And especially this Holocaust movie, I'm just writing about it. So that's why I have it just presented. Elie Wiesel already wrote in the year when it appeared, it's trivializing the Holocaust. And he warned from semi-fiction, semi-fact. So he's already problematizing it. And I remember I was forced by my history teacher to see it, as well as my fellow pupils. And with me, it had a very shocking impact, but I know others that were just counting uniform buttons. It just depends on the context. You know, this was a very militarist family, and he was just keen to see a lot of Nazi uniforms. And the thing is, I think it's a very problematic thing to work on this kind of emotionalizing storytelling. First of all, I think it's misleading a lot, because, you know, they created these characters. In the film Holocaust, there's everything. They even are in Babin Yar, and they are in Auschwitz, they are in Mauthausen. All the stories in Theresienstadt. I work with the survivor Judah Bakon. He described me scenes that were in the Holocaust. Everything was packed into this movie, which is also something that Wiesel criticizes. And the problem is, it didn't help me. I can imagine, I can remember myself even reading the book from Anne Frank diary, with tears in my eyes, very emotionally moved, and I had no cognitive dissonance in listening to the Nazi stories of my grandmother and my grandaunts in the same time. I didn't bring it together. It was not a problem. I was already 16 back then. So I'm very much against this kind of emotionalizing of the whole thing.
Thank you. This is very interesting, and this is certainly very important. I think that what we are trying to explore in different projects here is precisely how to not fall in the pitfalls of. Listen, I recently heard, let's say, a very important person here in Serbia describing a certain exhibition as very successful and there people were coming out with tears in their eyes. And I said, what the hell are you talking about? Is that a successful exhibition? You know, like, give me 5 minutes with everybody and I will make them cry. Is this education? Or, I mean, the question is, what is the point? What is the goal? And then I'm getting back to this. I really like our cooperation with Wolfgang and Karin opened my eyes on certain in certain, let's say, directions of that. For instance, let's get into this dialogue with the youngsters without having particular goal in mind. Let's see what will happen. We are getting there with knowledge and experiences as being older and being educators. And let's see what we can get from them and use the space and experience and what they believe they know and turn it into a new value. Also, what I think is forgotten or not used enough, or maybe should be used more, is this idea of learning history, not focusing on local and national, but trying, at least, because it is quite challenging, to look at it in a transnational way. And it has been mentioned several times today that the Austrians, and here we in Serbia, we are sharing this history, both on the being involved as perpetrators and victims, and this particular place that we are talking about, this Staro Sajmiste concentration camp, where was run by mostly Austrian Nazis. Also, Jews from Austria have been killed in the camp. So I think that this meeting between us, let's say Austrians and people from Serbia, in talking about this and trying to figure out what does it mean today and what should we do with this? What should we do with this acknowledgement that this happened? I think could lead to very interesting ways of achieving the goals that are described in for instance, Ira's description of why are we even teaching about the Holocaust? And it is, again, developing this critical thinking and growing as persons and being able to deal with the problems that we have in today's societies, but also by keeping the memory.
We spoke also about the situation. Lidija told us more about visitation to Staro Sajmiste, and then even a teacher from Sopot told us about the dilemmas the teachers are that he's experiencing in teaching about Holocaust and now preparation for to go to visit Staro Sajmiste. He used the person, the survivor, Jewish survivor, who was hidden in Sopot, in his place where there are no Jewish, there's no Jewish community at all, and wasn't even before the war, and about the story of this man who was hiding in Sopot, and the stories that they're hearing more often and often about those people who were helping Jewish family who actually make money and profit of hiding people, and took their properties and build houses based on Jewish properties before that they looted during the war, and how difficult it is to address that. And even says for us is really, really difficult. We are trying to find a way how we can confront our local community with the stories that we don't know, without pointing the finger into the people and say, you see what your pre-ancestors did. and how that was the story that we heard about Litau by Dr. Zuroff, and how we are also having the same doubts and same problems in our own communities.
We went quite far away, actually, and also came back to the situation in Ukraine, wondering about young people, right-wing people, neo-Nazis who might be joining forces on both sides, actually, now in an armed conflict. And Friedemann was pointing to the very fact that it was in the media, in the news in Austria and Germany initially in the first week of the conflict, and then it kind of vanished. So the question is, what would be their experiences to come back with? What would be the realization of Russian soldiers on the front line if they see Nazi symbols on the other side, because there is militia fighting on the Ukrainian side, which is a repercussion of something they are told by propaganda. And all of a sudden there is an anchor in reality. Not saying that this is the case, but they might meet something like that. And also what it means in terms of the experiences made, if we think back of the situation in Syria, what the anxieties were about European youngsters moving to this area of war and coming back with a certain understanding and experience also mainly. So that were where we stayed in our conversation for quite a bit. And then we were talking about how this war topic is now the conversation. It's about this framing also of military stuff. And then we tried to walk back and lack the time actually to discuss what it means for the consciousness of young people. And this is how it relates to what Nevena just said. How can we move into a consciousness, it had been us, rather than pointing the finger? What does it mean for us today that this is our heritage, actually? This is connected to our societies. How do we unpack this? And do we actually have all we need in our educational framework? Is it only education? Do we need to have other capacities and abilities? And I give it to Andrea because she raises her hand and takes me out of me bubbling here. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, it was just a thought that came after, like in the last seconds of when we were talking, because we were talking a lot about war, also about how war is linked, or militarizing of actions is linked to the past or to heritages or history. But somehow I also thought about that war in the way as I experience it now is a break-in of reality of the present also, that I'm quite overwhelmed with how I can react to it with a training that somehow is very much directed towards a diligent working on historical issues, or also to find out methods and strategies onto how to look into history and understand it properly, and also how to teach it, of course, which is not only by telling facts, but by telling also experiences or by possibilities on how not to dissociate with the past, but how to somehow understand the links of the past and the present. And somehow I feel really unprepared, even though my argument always was like dealing with history is about working on the present. And the reason for it is to have something for present conflicts. I feel quite unprepared on the break-in of reality that now comes in with people deciding, or men deciding to go to war, to fight on one of the sides, and how this links to a history. And yeah, this was my question.
Yeah, we have this project in Serbia by a group of excellent teachers, which is called How to Teach About History That Is Not Yet History, which is a little bit what you, Andrea, is describing. You are trying to teach about something that is ongoing. This is not yet history, and it's, of course, obviously very challenging. Schmidt, please take over.
I wanted just to add something to what Andrea said, because if we observe ourselves in when the war started, I think I just assume it now that everyone had this kind of there was a kind of memory of the grandparents' experiences. So there's a lot of knowledge that is non-verbal knowledge. I remembered when I was in Israel and I experienced the first rocket attack. It triggered so much that was much more than the actual event. So actually, maybe this could be a strategy to talk about how we can kind of reactivate and dig out, like in an archaeological way, all this knowledge that is actually already there. And I'm sure it's in each one of us.
I just would like to add one impression also from the start of the war is that I work in an institution with directors, with a directors collective who come from Croatia, and I've immediately after the war in Ukraine started, and of course discussions were going on, I felt the urge to ask them, what is war? I don't know what is war. What is war that is experienced in a lifetime? And it doesn't help that my great grandparents have had this situation of having to make decisions and positioning oneself also in a situation of war. And this actually is irritating. What does it mean that I have a feeling I don't have anything to say here?
We discussed questions like also in relation to the Dr. Zuroff's keynote, the doubt if Germany is really so great. So Avi told me that he had an argument once with him that he doubts that Germany really does things in such a great way, especially when it's about education. Then we also talked about the other side of the coin, that teachers and students from Germany alike report that they have a kind of feeling overwhelmed with Holocaust education because it pops up in different subjects and kind all the time, and they in a way disconnect from it. And then there was the question, how is it done in Austria? And what I actually don't know, but we both agreed that we are not sure if there is so much knowledge regarding content, but also regarding methods of teaching the Holocaust that people in Austria and Germany tend to think there is. So I personally think that the education of people who become teachers, the teacher training, is not really advanced in this perspective. There are not really tools developed to give it hand. So we discussed also about this, and also about the perspective of empathy as a basic where things need to start.
I'm living in Germany. I'm originally from Israel. I'm living in Germany, and I had a lot to do, not directly as a teacher. I'm a psychotherapist in my profession, but I was lecturing a lot of times in schools, and met also teachers who were educating or trying to educate about the Holocaust. And most of the time, the lack of knowledge is amazing. It's mainly because of their empathy for this theme, for this topic, and not so much that they are knowledgeable about it. And there is in the program, in the curriculum, there is no special place for the Holocaust. They take the Second World War, and they could jungle with it as they want, and each one make it as he tatsächlich indeed as they want, and the result is that for some students it's overdoing. They're getting too much from different perspective, which they don't want anymore to hear about it, because either they get the same thing. A lot of times it's to do with numbers and so on. It doesn't interest them. There have to be a curriculum. My ex-wife was a teacher also a history and philosophy teacher, also taught always the Holocaust in her classes, and she explained me once that they have to have a spiral curriculum. It's something that every year you get higher and higher, and not that you get every time from different teachers again a package that you don't know how to digest it. And it's, if not systematic, it doesn't come in. I met a lot of students that are very, very interested in the topic, but they are fed up with it, fed up with the topic. And we talked also about visiting a concentration camp, which is in Austria. It's Mauthausen, but here there are enough concentration camps where one can visit. I think this experience is going under the skin, and that's maybe the most important part of this, because you can very, very easily sympathize. I just told I've been in Buchenwald 2 weeks ago, and it was freezing, and you stand there on this ramp, and it's so cold, and you are very well clothed. You understand more than anything, more than 1,000 words, what it means to be a prisoner.
I think that we are going to go towards conclusions of today's meeting. First of all, thank you for the brave ones that stayed until the very end. It was, I would say, very interesting. Our idea was to touch upon the problem of Holocaust distortion, and we did. Also, we spoke about authentic sites. We did on the example of Staro Sajmiste, but also mentioning other places are in the discussion. Independently of it, if those sites are well marked, or if there are memorials there or monuments or not, there is still a possibility that these sites are in service of either distortion or not fully disclosing the history. And the question is how much we can learn from it. And again, what and why we are even remembering, and what's the purpose of teaching and learning about these issues. We haven't been talking so much about contemporary anti-Semitism, even though I hope that we will be mentioning this a little bit at least more. Still, we concluded at certain points that the distortion of the Holocaust is always either inspired by or leading to certainly more anti-Semitism. And I think that we will have to do more on raising awareness about this topic. From our experience, we know that a lot of teachers are mixing that teaching about the Holocaust is sufficient to replace teaching about anti-Semitism, or the other way around, that teaching about anti-Semitism is sufficient to replace teaching about the Holocaust, which is totally not the case. Those two things are different topics. They are overlapping. It is helpful to know more about anti-Semitism to understand the Holocaust. It is helpful to know more about the Holocaust to understand anti-Semitism, but one is not the same as the other, and certainly teaching about one is not enough or sufficient to replace the other. And I think that this is something that we need to work further with, even though we are claiming that our work is that we are working with teaching about the Holocaust and this history in order to tackle contemporary challenges in our societies. In any case, there is a project MemAct, and you saw the link to the new and final conference of the project. Also on Terraforming's website, where you maybe registered for this conference, you can find the link to the other project called HANA, and you can learn more about that one, which is more concretely focusing on teaching about anti-Semitism. And also, I invite you that are not so much familiar with our work to look at the Terraforming's website and a lot of teaching materials and publications that you can use. Many of it, well, most of it is also in English. And among other things, talking about storytelling, we have educational graphic novels about the Holocaust. So again, thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much for staying until the end, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.